Good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. Our speaker this morning comes to us from New York. Kathryn J. Mathis has been Senior Vice President for Marketing and Communications at Standard & Poor's since September of 2009. Her responsibilities including creating and executing communication strategy, developing and communicating key messages on behalf of the entire S&P franchise, developing and implementing an employee communications program, internal and external crisis management, brand stewardship, and implementing a global marketing program across the franchise. She is a member of the company's senior management team and serves as Standard & Poor's primary spokesman. Previously, Ms. Mathis has been Senior Vice President for Corporate Communications at the New York Times Company. Before that, she was Vice President for Corporate Communication at the Times, and prior to that was the company's Director of Investor Relations. In 2006, Ms. Mathis was named Communicator of the Year by the New York chapter of the International Association of Business Communicators. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration and an MBA degree in marketing and management information systems from the University of Minnesota. She has served on the board of the National Investor Relations Institute, the Better Business Bureau of Metropolitan New York, and is a past president of the Investor Relations Association. I have known Kathryn for more than 10 years, and in that time have watched with admiration and awe as she restructured communications at the New York Times, struggled with the business model of modern news-gathering organizations, and handled it all with grace and dignity. Given the number of people who regard the New York Times as the bellwether of American newspapers, I know that was a highly visible and pressure-packed job. Her new assignment in the credit rating business is no less challenging and no less visible. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Kathryn Mathis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I am very, very pleased to be with all of you here today. When Professor O'Rourke told me that the title of this series was 10 Years Hence, I thought to myself, 10 years hence? I don't know what it's going to look like in the next 10 minutes, never mind 10 years hence. And it reminded me of something that the famous baseball player Yogi Berra once said. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Now, Yogi obviously did not know Professor O'Rourke. He obviously did not go to school at Notre Dame. But I do think that he was on to something, because when I step back and I look at the changes that have occurred over the last 10 years, they have been nothing short of stunning. People today are more informed and better connected to others around the globe than they have ever been. Globalization and technology have had a tremendous effect, both on business and on communications. Years ago, businesses were accountable only to a handful of stakeholders, and then in geographic areas that were important to them. Now, an email that a customer sends could end up halfway around the world with a ripple effect. A company can become a YouTube sensation or a victim overnight. 10 years ago, BlackBerry and Apple were fruits to most people. If you wanted to access the internet from home, you dialed into it. If you wanted to record a television show, videotapes the size of Bibles, the printed version of the Bible, that is, were needed. And then you could only record for an hour or two. Now, many people don't even own television sets. People go to Hulu or BitTorrent. So predictions are a risky business. At the same time, people like myself, people who are managers, are being paid to try to look around corners and to anticipate what changes are coming on down the pike. So I'm comforted by the fact that it often takes time between conception to development to mass adoption so that we can, in fact, anticipate some of the trends that are coming. So today what I want to do is talk about what's happening in our business, how that relates to the work that I do as a communicator, and how those trends are going to play out over the course of the coming decade. And there are really three trends that I want to focus on. The first is the increasing demand for transparency that we're seeing from our customers, from investors, from employees, and other stakeholders. The second that I want to focus on is the digital revolution and what it has meant to all of us. And then thirdly, I want to talk about globalization. All of these trends are interconnected. They tend to reinforce one another, and they have had a profound effect and will have a profound effect on the years to come, both on companies and on communications. But before I discuss these three areas, let me set the stage. As Jim said, 6 months ago, I left the New York Times Company and joined Standard & Poor's. I went from the media world to the financial world. And I can tell you, I felt like Alice in Wonderland after she tumbled down the rabbit hole, because it was a whole new world. The lexicon of the financial world in and of itself was extraordinary. When you think about the terminology, RMBS, CMBS, ABS, CDOs, CLOs, I think the headline the first week was going to be, "Woman Drowns in Sea of Acronyms." It was totally different. Most people know Standard & Poor's because of one of our benchmark indices, the S&P 500. It's interesting. Some people actually don't make the connection of Standard & Poor's, S&P 500. It was like when I was at the New York Times, people would talk about the New York Times being in Times Square and wouldn't recognize that Times Square was named for the New York Times. But literally, people have trillions of dollars invested in products that are tied to the S&P 500. Beyond it, though, we also, as Jim pointed out, we provide credit ratings to both companies and governments around the world. And this obviously has been in the headlines lately. More about that later. We are also one of the largest publishers of independent equity research. We provide a wealth of data and analytics, in part through a web-based program called Capital IQ. In short, what we do is we provide the tools, the analysis, and the research that many investors need to make informed decisions about their investments. In total, we employ about 11,000 people in 23 countries around the world. Last year, our revenues were $2.6 billion, and we are part of the McGraw-Hill Companies, which is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And we've been around for a very long time. Not as long as Notre Dame, but this year we're celebrating our 150th anniversary. It was in 1860 that Henry Varnum Poor, the handsome gentleman you see pictured here, wrote The History of Railroads and Canals in the United States. And at that time, railroads were a very important part of the US economy. The availability of corporate records, third-party research was very, very limited. And what Poor did was send out letters to companies in the railroad industry asking them for information. And then he went and compiled this book. In other words, what Poor was doing was creating transparency, the first of the three trends that I want to talk about with you today. Essentially, what he was doing was the same thing that an investigative reporter would do. He was going out, he was digging up facts, and then he was reporting them to the public. And in fact, at one time, Poor had been an editor at the New York Times. The word transparency comes from Latin, and it means to be seen through. In the corporate world, it denotes a willingness to disclose on a timely basis relevant information to the marketplace. It also employs an openness in communications. Transparency is critical to the smooth functioning of the financial markets. And as a result of that, I think it's going to become even more and more important as financial markets become increasingly global. Over the past decade, we have at times seen a considerable lack of transparency. And as a result of that, businesses, governments, and others have violated stakeholder trust and have shown very plainly how its loss corrodes reputation. Think about some of the top headlines that have come out of the last decade. Enron collapses. No weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. Lehman files for bankruptcy. Just this past week, after 11 years of publishing a list of the best corporate citizens, Corporate Responsibility magazine published the worst in terms of transparency. And in this context, when they thought about transparency, they were thinking about, does this company disclose its climate change policies? Does this company disclose its employee benefit practices? Does it disclose its philanthropic efforts? The editor said that they tried to contact all the worst companies on the list, but perhaps not surprisingly, they didn't get any response. Interestingly enough, the companies on the best list far outperformed the companies on the worst list in terms of total shareholder return. Very interesting fact. Similarly, every year for the last 10 years, Edelman, the global public relations firm, has gone out and done a survey they call the Trust Barometer. And they've gone to 4,000 to 5,000 people in 22 countries around the world, all of them college-educated people, and asked them questions about corporate reputations. What are the attributes that are most important for a corporate reputation? Who are the entities that most influence corporate reputations? Who do you trust the most to provide you with information? And it's interesting, because what you can see behind me is that for the first time, this year's study showed that trust and transparency ranked at the top of the list. They're more important to corporate reputation even than the quality of a company's products and services. Now, if you combine the findings of these two studies, I think it's safe to conclude that transparency is becoming more important. It's a well-known maxim in business that incentives drive behavior. So if, in fact, that is the case, and thinking back to what I said about total shareholder return and the best companies, I think that what may end up happening is that companies who obfuscate will be punished, and those who are more transparent will be rewarded. And if this is, in fact, true, over time, what I think you'll begin to see is more and more a shift towards greater transparency. And that's going to have significant consequences for businesses and for people like myself who are in communications, because what we are going to have to do is a better job of educating our management teams on how to communicate in a more transparent manner. And for some people, this is going to be a very difficult change, because you think about it, oftentimes managers want to operate on a need-to-know basis. They want to parse out information. They want to hold it close. And quite frankly, there are times when, as a communication strategy, this makes very good business sense. Think about the launch of the iPad. Think of how the secrecy around it created a certain sense of anticipation, of excitement. But then it doesn't always work. Think also about what's happened with Toyota and how they have communicated their manufacturing issues and recall. Encouraging managements to be transparent while helping them to execute their strategy and their private plans is going to be a real balancing act. Each company will have different factors to consider. But I believe that transparency is going to rank high among the attributes affecting corporate reputations in the coming decade. And I think that is due in part to the fact that we have just experienced a financial crisis unlike any that you have certainly seen in your lifetime or I have seen in mine. As a result of it, Congress has proposed legislation that would reform financial institutions and market participants. And part of this legislation specifically focuses on transparency. There will be requirements to improve transparency if, in fact, this legislation goes through. Credit rating agencies, such as Standard & Poor's, are part of it. And we support many aspects of the legislation that do improve transparency, improve accountability, improve oversight of credit rating agencies. Because from where we stand, we believe it's important for the restoration of confidence that all market participants take a look and say, what went wrong and how can we fix it? Transparency plays a huge role in it because we think it's the single greatest contributor to credibility and to trust. At Standard & Poor's, we have been actively applying a number of the lessons from the financial crisis to adopt some constructive measures. And a key component of what we have done is to try to help people understand what it is that we do and how we go about doing it. This means expanding the amount and the types of information that we provide to our investors and others. It means that in the past we thought that it was enough to provide people with the conclusions of our analysis. Now what we are doing is also providing the assumptions and the criteria that we use in arriving at our conclusions. It means answering questions like, how have our ratings performed? What is the process that a security goes through in order to be rated? It means, how do our ratings compare across asset classes? Even before the financial crisis, the demand for transparency was increasing, both for companies and for governments. As a result, the line between outside behaviors and inside behaviors has blurred. You think about it. Think about the old saying. It used to be that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And I think to a large extent that's how a lot of companies operated. But no more. Today, when we write, for example, our employee memos, we write them knowing that they're going to find their way to the outside. They're going to find their way to the hands of the New York Times. And in fact, sometimes what we do is we actually distribute them to the media at the same time, because we recognize that our customers, our employees, our investors all want and expect openness and transparency as never before. One of the reasons for this is the second major trend that I want to talk about today, and that is the digital revolution. Like other businesses, the effect of technology and Web 2.0 on our business has been considerable. It's both increased the volume and the speed of communication. It has also made it easier for us to take the pulse of what our customers are thinking and what they want. In 2008, two employees from Forrester Research, Charlene Lee and Josh Burnoff, published a book called Groundswell. And this term applies to, or it refers to the phenomenon of people using technologies to get the things they want from each other as opposed to going to companies. And some companies that deal directly with consumers, such as the print media, have been on the bleeding edge of this phenomenon. Think about what happened when Craigslist came into being. What was the effect on newspaper classifieds? While we at Standard & Poor's have not experienced this, we certainly are aware of its potential, and we're looking at how it could influence our clients' behaviors. And we've changed the way that we provide information to our clients, just as newspapers have shifted from print to online, we too are saying, how can we give our information to our customers in the format that they want? Do they want it in print? Do they want it in podcast? Do they want it in video? Do they want it in text? Do they want it in mobile? Because what we want to do is provide it in whatever means they want to receive it. Another way we're transforming our business and using technology to meet customer needs is in the development of customizable models and tools. The market wants to be able to take our consumptions and compare it to their assumptions. They want to see how changes might affect a company, a sector, or a security. And this has been an area of growth for us. Historically, we developed our models for our own use. Now we've developed a full business line devoted to developing, expanding, and licensing our intellectual capital. 10 or 15 years ago, this business wouldn't have existed because we didn't have the technology in place. We didn't have the platforms in order to accomplish it. Social media has had less of an effect on our business than others because we are in the B2B space and because many of our businesses are regulated. Because most of our customers have been slow in adopting social media, our embrace has been somewhat uneven over our organization. But nonetheless, we have been embracing it where it has made good business sense. So for example, one of our analysts, Howard Silverblatt, was named one of the top 4 people to follow if you're an individual investor on Twitter. Our leverage commentary and our data group has gone out and created a Facebook fan page. They've created YouTube channels. All of this because we want to be able to communicate more effectively with our audiences. And I will tell you that across our organization, important information if you're a graduating senior, we use LinkedIn for recruitment purposes. We know even for companies like ourselves that are heavily regulated and that are in the B2B space, that social media is going to be an important avenue for us going forward. Just consider this. Forrester Research forecasts that B2B social media marketing spending will grow from just $11 million in 2009 to $54 million in 2014. Now that's still tiny compared to the $2.3 billion that Forrester said that B2B companies spent on interactive marketing in 2009, and the $4.8 billion that they expect to spend in 2014. But it is a significant increase. To develop our digital muscles, one of the things that we did was we created what we call a reverse mentoring program. And what that means is that we want people your age to come and teach people my age about social media. So participants talk about technology, they talk about cultural and generational issues. One of the things that we also did recently was we held a digital exhibition that showcased new digital products across our organization. And one of the new products that McGraw-Hill is piloting is an interactive math program for kids that are in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. It's a program called Planet Turtle. And it's a lot of fun. You get on and you progress throughout the various levels. What was interesting to me about this was that it's available in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Mandarin. Which brings me to the 3rd area that I want to cover, and that's globalization. As I mentioned earlier, Standard & Poor's operates in 23 countries around the world. One of the biggest changes for me as I moved from the New York Times to Standard & Poor's was that I went from an organization of 12 people, all of whom were in New York City, to almost 60 people around the world. So while technology has enabled us to communicate faster and easier, the language differences, the time differences, the customs still make operating on a global scale more complicated. A decade ago, Standard & Poor's generated about a quarter of its revenues from outside the United States. Last year, that number was around 40%. And the reason for that is that our businesses outside the United States have been growing at a rate about twice that of our domestic businesses. And Asia in particular holds significant promise for us. China is almost certain to grow steadily in international importance. Its GDP is on track to rank behind only that of the United States this year. And the countries in the Greater China region, I think, are going to hold on to China's economic coattails as they increasingly move ahead. Standard & Poor's currently has offices in Beijing and Hong Kong. This year, we're adding another in Shanghai. Similarly, this year, we opened 2 offices in India, which is on track to become a top 5 world global economy by 2030. Of the 11,000 employees that we have at Standard & Poor's, 6,000 of them are currently in India. If you go back 10 years ago, none of them were. Given the fact that emerging markets are emerging, they're going to account for a growing share of world GDP. And as they do so, they're going to need more and more financial services. Because of that, we expect an increasing portion of our business to come from outside the United States in the coming decade. One of the most interesting challenges we face as communicators today is how to reach across the globe, but still remain locally and culturally relevant to our customers, policymakers, and business partners. As China and India continue to emerge economically and more of people in those countries connect to the internet, I think we can be confident that this trend will continue. These 3 factors, transparency, the digital revolution, globalization, they're going to profoundly affect our businesses and the way that we communicate. And I think this is also going to have a profound effect for all of you as you take the skills and the experience that you have acquired at Notre Dame and move out into the workplace. What is that going to mean? I think it's going to mean that you are going to be in a world that's more interconnected. It's going to be more technologically sophisticated. It's going to be a more complicated world. It means that you are going to work with more people of different backgrounds, and that you're going to need the psychological, social, and intellectual attributes that make up a global mindset. If you haven't seen this most recent issue of Harvard Business Review, I'd encourage you to pick it up. It has a very interesting article about working outside the United States. And you can take a test to judge your global mindset. I think the good news is that for your generation and for the generation that comes behind you, you're going to have more tools in your arsenal to work around the world. And I'm not just talking about gadgets. I think that you're going to find ways to develop new ways to learn, to create, and to think. I think there'll be greater out-of-the-box thinking that's going to come from all the changes that you're seeing. In February, the Pew Research Center released a study on the future of the internet. And it was quite interesting. They said in it that 80% of the experts that they surveyed agreed that the hot gadgets and applications that will capture the imagination of users in 2020, will come out of the blue. And I think that it's true. We're going to be amazed at the innovation and the ingenuity that comes from the laboratories and the garages from around the world. But I think one of the most interesting things that's going to happen is the unpredictable or the unintended consequences of some of those innovations. When you take a look and you go back in time and you look at what happened when cars came about, there were many people who anticipated the invention of the automobile. But what they didn't anticipate was the advent of the suburbs, the creation of people living far from where they were going to work as a result of their ability to move about more quickly. So let me just close by saying that there's one thing that I can predict with some certainty, and that is that the changes that we'll see in the next decade will continue to catch us by surprise. But at the same time, the demands for transparency, the use of digital technology, and the globalization of our businesses, indeed, our lives, will only increase. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate your inviting me to come and be with you here today. Now, are there any questions?
Hi, thanks for speaking with us. This is very interesting. Could you address the lead up to the financial meltdown and S&P's overvaluing of those risky derivatives, and like what did you guys learn? What are you guys going to do to correct that kind of catastrophic oversight in the future?
Yes. As you probably know, the President Obama in May appointed a commission called the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. And it's modeled after the Pecora Commission, which was created in the aftermath of the Great Depression to look at the causes of it. They are going through, it's a bipartisan commission, which will report to Congress, to the President, and to the American people in December on the causes of the financial crisis. And they have come up with a list of 22 specific areas that they're looking at. And those areas include everything from federal and state financial regulations, compensation, short selling, accounting practices, and the credit rating agencies and what their role was. We ourselves have taken a look at this and said, what went wrong and what could we do better going forward? We rate every year about $32 trillion worth of securities. Of that $32 trillion, about $2 trillion were in the area of what they call residential mortgage-backed securities. And this was an area where what we expected to happen did not turn out to be the case. Those securities, when we took a look at those securities, what we did was anticipate what was going to happen in the housing markets. And we built in declines because our expectation was that in the US, you would see a decline in housing prices. What we did not anticipate was the degree to which housing prices would decline. Overall, a drop of 30 to 35%. So what we have done is we have gone back and we have taken a look and we've revised the criteria that we use to rate securities. And now we say that they would have to meet a Great Depression type of scenario in order to get the highest rating that we give, which is a AAA. We've also gone back and taken a look at our internal procedures and processes in terms of how we rate the securities. What can we do better? It's interesting, when I was at the New York Times, we had a situation that came about where one of our reporters plagiarized and fabricated quotes. We were just talking about this before I started to speak, a reporter by the name of Jason Blair. And in the aftermath of what happened, the Times took a look and came up with over 20 steps that they needed to do in order to improve their journalism. We basically went through the same thing at Standard & Poor's. We took a look back and we came up with what we call 27 leadership actions that we felt would improve the ratings process, that would improve transparency. And you can go to smp.com and you can see what these steps were and how we performed against it. And it's interesting because many of the things that the Times did to improve their journalism are not unlike what we have done to improve the ratings and the ratings process. So for example, in the aftermath of the Jason Blair situation, they said, we need to improve the training of our journalists. We did the same thing. We're taking all of our analysts now must go through a certification process that we have created in conjunction with New York University to make sure that they are as good as they can be when it comes to rating debt. One of the things the Times did was they said, we've got to create a position of a public editor so that anybody who has a question about journalism can go to that public editor and ask them. We did the same thing. We created the position of an ombudsman. So if an issuer, if an investor, if an employee, anyone has a question about any of S&P's products, not just ratings, they can go to the ombudsman and raise that issue. So there are a lot of things that we've done. It's always difficult, though, because I think that what happens oftentimes is that you fight the last war. You look at what happened and say, how can we correct that? What we're trying to do is also look forward and anticipate some of the issues that may come. One of the biggest problems we face right now in terms of regulation is making sure that what we do in the United States to strengthen our processes are done around the world. Because different governments have different regulatory regimes. Oftentimes the things that we have suggested and the things that we're planning to do are at a higher level than those in other countries. But what we're trying to do is to make it uniform across all the countries in which we operate. Does that address? Thank you for your question.
Kathryn, let me ask a question about whether Standard & Poor's takes an advocate's role in the marketplace regarding practices. And one of them you mentioned is short selling. Mm-hmm. There are those who argue that short sellers, much like itinerants who collect aluminum cans, perform a valuable service for the marketplace, and they ought to be permitted to operate essentially unimpeded. There are those, you don't have to go very far to find a list of people who say that they're predators, that they're harmful to the marketplace. I think the CEO at Overstock.com was probably leading the parade on that one. Does S&P have a viewpoint about short selling or practices such as that? And has the company become an advocate for reform, or is this something that the company wants to leave to the commission and to the government?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the things that we have tried to do, just not unlike a journalistic organization, is that we have tried to maintain analytical independence. And so we have not taken a position on that. We don't take a position on many policy issues. And because we want to be independent of them, and we are concerned that if we did take a position, that could ultimately come back against us. Where we have taken positions, Jim, are specifically with regard to some of the issues concerning credit rating agencies specifically. So for example, with the legislation that's now pending in Washington, there is a section of the bill that talks directly to changes that should be made. And we have been very supportive of most of the provisions in that bill. The one area where we haven't has been with regard to liability, where they want to make the credit rating agencies more liable than, say, auditors or others. And there we've said, what we want to do is be held to the same standard that others are held.
I do have a follow-up, if I may.
Please.
I'm curious about the firewall, which was depicted, though not thoroughly explained. Let me ask about that. In the investment banks, the firewall in some banks was regarded as sacrosanct and in others was a useful fiction. The mergers and acquisition business frequently tainted the recommendations made over on the investment side. Can you explain how the firewall works at S&P from the analytic services and from the rating services?
Yes.
And can you explain what the attitude regarding that firewall is within the company?
Yeah. What Jim is referring to is that the analysts who rate the debt are segmented or walled off from the people who are involved in commercial transactions. So if I'm going to rate debt, what is my relationship to the person who's going out and calling on a company hoping to persuade them that they should have Standard & Poor's rate their debt? And that firewall is pretty high and pretty wide. And the reason for that is the same reason it exists in investment banks, or it exists, for example, in newspapers between the journalistic side and the editorial and the business side. And the way that we do that is, I mean, physically, they are separated from one another. We also put them through a pretty rigorous training program, which every person in the company actually goes through, and it walks you through a series of things that you can and cannot do with regard to talking to the companies about business-related matters for the rating itself. So, for example, if I'm a rating analyst and I go out and I call on Notre Dame wants to raise capital, I need to talk to them about their financial performance. I need to get data from them. I need to know what their plans are. But if, say, in the course of that conversation, Notre Dame says, you know, we'd also be interested in buying some of your equity research for you. What do I, as a rating analyst, do? What my responsibility to do is to say, thank you, we're very polite people, and then go on and say, I will refer you to the person who's responsible for that, because I, as a rating analyst, should not be having that discussion. I should leave that to people who are on the commercial side of the business.
You talked a little bit about non-U.S. growth, and specifically you mentioned India being one of the top 5 non-U.S. growth coming. I'm wondering what would be driving that growth if it weren't for U.S. jobs?
What we have seen in India is that there are many, many small enterprises that are springing up. It's not simply the outsourcing sector, which has certainly been an important part of that. As a matter of fact, this year, Standard & Poor's rated its 10,000th SME, small, medium enterprise. So I think what you find happening is that even within India's own industry, there are smaller organizations that are springing up and coming to the market asking for ratings. So that's an important piece of it. The offices that we opened in India were offices where they're helping us with our back office operations. So that's certainly a key component of that. I don't mean to diminish it in any way. But based on what I've been hearing from our folks, it's not limited to that alone.
Hello. Is it on? Okay. I was actually wondering, you were talking about how growth has been, you know, essentially much faster outside the United States. Do you run into any, does Standard & Poor's as kind of a rating institution run into any problems? And like, does globalization present new issues? Is it more difficult to rate in other countries? I mean, I was wondering about the kind of the climate that you run into.
It is interesting. We just, this morning, I was on my BlackBerry on an issue related to China. I think one of the things that happens is that because we are an American company, sometimes we are viewed as something of an interloper when we go into other countries. And certainly we've seen this in the Far East. There are difficulties in doing that. One of the areas for growth for us has been in rating sovereign nations. So if you go back to, say, 1975, we had ratings on 7 countries. Right now, we have ratings on 123 countries, and in the United Nations, there are 192 member states. So that's increased significantly. One of the reasons that it has increased, quite frankly, is because there are more countries to rate. When you think about what happened in the former Soviet Union, when that fell apart, more countries were created, and therefore there were more nations that wanted credit ratings. But it does produce a host of issues. One of the things that we have found most successful is employing nationals in the country in which we operate. So, for example, in India, the woman who is the head of our Indian operation was born and raised in India. She knows the country, she knows the business community, she knows the environment. And that's been a successful approach that we've taken. I think we've placed far fewer expatriates overseas in the last 10 years than we had in the previous 10, because it just seems to make better business sense. They're more familiar with the local customs, the local enterprises, the local industry. It's a much more effective strategy. But it has been, it's been an interesting adventure.
As kind of a follow-up, could you comment at all on Euro area countries and like what Greece and Portugal and Spain are going through, like how you rate their debt, for instance?
This has been an area of real controversy because, as you can imagine, the countries like Spain and Greece have not been particularly happy with the credit rating agencies because their debt has been downgraded. And this is always the tension that you face, because we present independent views of the countries, and they don't always like what we say. We're in constant discussions with them on their plans so that we can rate the debt and so that we can keep updating our position on the debt as we go along. For us as a market, Europe is a relatively mature market. We've operated in Europe for over 25 years. And their financial markets are more mature than, say, they are in Asia. So it's been a very good area of the world for us. Most of our focus recently has shifted to the Far East because that's where we see the most in terms of growth opportunities.
Other questions? They're quiet. Kathryn, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
On behalf of the faculty and students, a pen, we'll ask you to write back. Thanks kindly, and thanks kindly to you. Enjoy the day.